we spent several years like sort of poring over the research and trying to figure out like what are the keys. And one woman who, a national leader, argued that the most important thing on immigration is to widen the circle of concern. And what she meant by that is we needed to really double down on telling the story of how undocumented folks are us. They're just like us. They are members of our communities. They do all the things we do. They have all the same values we do. We are all the same. And that's not something our sort of go-to on the left is to want to call out an injustice and just expect that people will see the world like we do, and they'll feel like we need to do something about that. And it may be important, but insufficient. We actually have to really deliberately, with our storytelling, with our messaging, try to create a greater sense of connection, because that makes people it puts people in a much better place to be able to invoke empathy and get them to move.
Let's talk about creating a life and country we're proud of together. I'm your host, Alvina Vasquez. Welcome to Alvina Talks Shift. I'm so excited to have Bobby Clark with me. Bobby was really an innovator, but to me personally, a great mentor. I learned so much from you, Bobby. So I'm really excited to have you here with me because, I dropped into the political landscape in 2012. You were working on it at a very crucial time. Colorado was headed down the path of where we see like Florida going now. So while you describe who you are and what you do, tell us where you started from, what inspired you, and what major changes were you the catalyst of in Colorado?
Bobby Clark, I'm an independent consultant. I've been doing progressive work for a very long time. I sort of happened into it. I was working for now Governor Polis for an internet startup, and he pulled the funding, and he knew I didn't have anything else to do, and he asked me if I would come help him run a ballot measure in Colorado in 2002. And I did that. That's how I met Michael Hutner, who was consulting on that. And we lost. It was election day voter registration. We lost. And one of our big takeaways after that election was that there really needed to be more permanent progressive infrastructure to communicate, because at that point there wasn't any. Conservatives had it, Democrats didn't, and our capacity sort of ebbed and flowed with campaigns. And so that was the idea for Progress Now actually came out of that experience. And for me personally, I never really intended to be in progressive work. I stumbled into it, and I think that I had always been drawn to it. I grew up in Oklahoma in an evangelical community. I knew at an early age that I was gay. Didn't share that with anybody, but it was very difficult to grow up in that environment as someone who felt sort of intensely marginalized and othered internally, and I think it really sort of baked into me this idea that everybody should be treated fairly, and that kind of that kind of goal was worth fighting for. It just took me a while to actually get there to work on it full time.
I mean, it's interesting because so many people that you and I work with and know, we just happenstance ended up
right
in this infrastructure. And I kind of see it as like we're these misfits in policymaking and communications because we've found unique tactics to really change hearts and minds. And that's a phrase that I learned moving from like the private sector into this community service area. What does changing hearts and minds mean? Where did it come from?
That is something that I think is a lifelong pursuit to understand. I helped start Progress Now in late 2004, early 2005. Worked on that for a few years. That was very much at the beginning of progressive infrastructure in Colorado. And really, our focus at the time was just to take on the dominant conservative power. Conservatives have been in control of the state for 40 years and had gotten very much out of touch. And so like a lot of that work was really holding right-wing leaders to account and showing how they're out of touch with the public. I really started my journey on more deeply understanding moving hearts and minds when I left Progress Now and moved to Gill Foundation in 2010. I had an opportunity to go become the vice president for communications at Gill Foundation based in Denver. Gill is was at the time at least, the largest funder of LGBTQ equality in the country and deeply involved in the marriage equality fight. And so I stepped into my role at Gill Foundation at a pivotal moment for the marriage movement. We had lost, I believe, 28 states in a row on marriage. All that started on the election night in 2004 with 11 states passing anti-marriage ballot measures. And we continued to lose a bunch of states, including California, which was a big shock in 2008. After that loss, the LGBT movement really had to sort of step back and reassess. We had been very poll-driven at that point, and polling sort of led to a logical conclusion, which is marriage itself doesn't pull very high, but denying hospital visitation, overwhelmingly people think we shouldn't do that. And so the movement had in the early years of marriage work, it focused very much on kind of a rights and justice frame. It's not fair to deny people rights. And we kept losing, and we had to step back and reassess after losing California, which nobody saw coming. And so I had the great fortune of sort of stepping into this role. We were funding the Gill Foundation was funding the public opinion work very heavily. And one of the things we did at that time is we stepped back and we started doing a lot more qualitative, just listening to voters and trying to understand their perspective. And one of the things that emerged by adopting more of a sort of a listening stance and trying to understand voters and not just assuming that we could communicate with what felt right, which is, this is unfair. We learned that, a key issue we had is that most Americans didn't think that we wanted the same things, didn't think that we were like them. And we were actually reinforcing that idea by talking about marriage in unfamiliar ways. That's not how most people think about their marriage. They fall in love and want to make a lifetime commitment. So we understood at that point and began testing this idea that we need to actually create a greater sense of connection between same-sex couples and the broader population. We have the same values. We fall in love and want to make a lifetime commitment. We're the same. And that was the start of a real pivot on marriage and on one of the most successful public opinion shifts that I think any of us have experienced.
And with the changing political landscape now, is that at risk again?
Even when we won marriage, one of the first things we did after marriage was we had one of our vice presidents at Gill Foundation led an effort to evaluate work that had been done on other important efforts like work to secure and hold abortion rights, the civil rights movement. We did an analysis of all of that work, and one of the things that was abundantly clear to us is that rights are never won forever. Interesting. It's a continuing conversation that we need to have with our fellow Americans. And so I think it's a mistake for any of us to if we're working on something, if we secure a big win, to think that that's forever. We actually have to keep at it.
And since you've moved on onto other projects, I know that you're dipping your toe with the lessons you've learned in other key issues. So talk more about that work. What are the similarities and differences, and where are the successes to be made still?
When I left Gill Foundation in 2016, we had secured marriage. We'd made a lot of important investments in what we saw as other, really fundamental fights for equality, non-discrimination protections, holding back the line on religious exemptions. And I really wanted to get back to multi-issue work, and I thought there were so many things that we had learned on marriage that were broadly applicable. One is that I think is underappreciated about marriage is that we had a plan. After we lost 11 states, the night of November 2004, a work group was formed LGBT leaders led by Matt Coles from the ACLU, and they developed something called the 10-10-10-20 plan, or they called it a concept note. It didn't want it to be described as a plan. And it was there were a few really important things about it. One is that the premise of that was, well, first of all, we may not have chosen as a movement to prioritize marriage at that point because we were in the 30s in polling, but that fight was upon us. So we had to embrace it. And we developed a plan to win. And the idea was that we could, by 2020, we could win some combination of 10 states with marriage equality, full marriage equality, 10 states with something less like civil unions, and 10 states with something less like domestic partnerships. And that if we could achieve that, if we could have a majority of the states with some level of relationship recognition, that would be enough for Congress or the Supreme Court to act, because neither want to be out too far out ahead of the public. And so having that, just simply having an idea of where we wanted to head, so many movements don't have that. I think in immigration, I've done a lot of work in immigration since leaving Gill, and it's one of the constant challenges with immigration is, what is the North Star? Where are we trying to get? What focuses the movement? That's true on any number of issues. And I think on marriage, it can be argued that it was a simpler task because it was one issue, but we had a spot on the horizon that we knew we were trying to get to. We embraced that plan, the 10-10-10-20 plan, embraced essentially the first premise was, if we win public opinion, we will win the policy. And so we embraced the idea from the very beginning of being very public facing. Our job is to go persuade our fellow Coloradans, our fellow Americans, and build support. We needed to move beyond the 30s in public support to, significant majorities. And I also think that that's something that a lot of other issue areas don't embrace. They think that their job is to really just push elected leaders to be more bold on their issue and not do the hard work of actually moving public opinion. I think that was really important on marriage. It's important on other issues. We embraced incrementalism in the marriage plan. The idea was never to settle for less than full marriage for everybody, but to realize that we need to focus on what's possible right now in front of us and secure that win, and then keep fighting for more. That was a very, very important decision, and it gave us the opportunity to go engage and have the debate we needed to have. And then I think finally, when we made that shift from a rights and justice frame to a love and commitment frame, shared values were all the same. I think we stumbled on, I'm not sure the folks who were leading the charge there really fully appreciated what I think is true, which is that in-group, out-group perceptions are so dominant we are just hardwired as a species to think in terms of groups, and to have it's baked into our DNA. We have preferences for people who we see as like us and in our group, and we have a harder time being supportive of people we don't see in our group. But those associations are very fluid. They can be created on the fly. You just assign people, you're the red team, you're the blue team. Immediately, people make meaning out of that. And so that work on marriage to create a greater sense of familiarity between same-sex couples and the broader population was really important. I've done a lot of work. I've done a lot of work in immigration. I was part of a small work group. We spent several years sort of poring over the research and trying to figure out what are the keys. And one woman a national leader, argued that the most important thing on immigration is to widen the circle of concern. And what she meant by that is we needed to really double down on telling the story of how undocumented folks are us. They're just like us. They are members of our communities. They do all the things we do. They have all the same values we do. We are all the same. And that's not something our sort of go-to on the left is to want to call out an injustice and just expect that people will see the world like we do, and they'll feel like we need to do something about that. And it may be important, but insufficient. We actually have to really deliberately, with our storytelling, with our messaging, try to create a greater sense of connection, because that makes people it puts people in a much better place to be able to, invoke empathy and get them to move.
It's so interesting. At the beginning of this conversation, you said, being treated fairly. What does fair mean to you? What does fairly mean in today's political landscape?
That is a really deep question. That is I think what most people expect is that I've done lots of research now at this point, hundreds of thousands of survey responses, and I've seen lots and lots and lots of qualitative on a lot of different topics and watched voters talk. And I think there are some fundamental truths that really transcend race and income and experience. And that is that we all just want we don't want there to be any deliberate barriers put in our way to be able to achieve success in life. We believe that we should have the basic resources we need to be able to build a life. We had at work that I'm doing now on economic narrative, that there was this interesting moment where we were in focus groups during the Build Back Better debate, and we were, conservatives were really trying to trigger people around how much money that was all going to be. It was trillions of dollars, and there is a lot of sort of baked in suspicion in the public about government spending. And so we were in focus groups across race with some very swingy folks who were also very sensitive to spending. And we asked them, what if we spent $1 trillion on this list of 6 things: more affordable healthcare, more affordable childcare, broadband internet, extending the child tax credit, more affordable education. And one Latina in a group of women said, she described all of that, $1 trillion in government spending, as the foundation for self-reliance. And that was astounding to me, that she would describe so much government spending as the foundation for self-reliance. I think what I got from that, and what I've seen repeated now in lots of research, is we all feel as though our government, at least in this country, that our government should have our backs. Like, really, the right and appropriate role for our government is to look out for people. That we shouldn't be discriminated against just simply because of who we are or who we love. We should be free from that discrimination. But we also should have the building blocks that we need accessible to us. We don't have a fair shot in life if healthcare is just unattainable because it's so expensive. We don't have a fair shot in life if you can't afford housing. There's this idea that the role of our government is to ensure that we have that foundation, as she described, for self-reliance. But really, it's the foundation that we can choose to build our life on. It's not that we're seeking guarantees. It's that we're seeking the tools and the opportunities that we need to be able to build a life for ourselves, contribute to our communities, build our communities. I think that's sort of the basic idea of fairness that most people have.
I'm going to bop around here a little bit because we're talking about the work that you've done from coast to coast and everything in the middle. So when we talk about that transcendence and shared values, what have you learned about the flyover states? Some of these states are super influential in our political landscape, and some of them aren't, but all of them are driving our country in a direction. So what have you learned about those differences of different stages of our country?
Yeah, I have been, one of my clients for the last few years has been the Rural Democracy Initiative. It's actually 2 funding collaboratives, a C3 and a C4 funding collaborative, moving money into organizations and supporting people outside of urban areas to build civic capacity, to be able to re-engage with our fellow citizens in more rural areas, in those flyover states. And one of the things that, has been, well, first of all, part of the reason why RDI exists is because we recognize that there simply is no path to power from a progressive perspective. There's no path to power that doesn't run through rural America. We only have to look to the Senate to be able to see that staring us in the face. Vermont, South Dakota, they have as many senators as California does. So there is whether we like it or not, there is a rural bias in the Senate. And that same bias around districts exists in a lot of states in the way that their legislative districts are drawn. And so it is just a fundamental truth of our political system that there is outsized power for people who live in rural areas. And so, we have a couple of choices we could make. One is what we have been making for the last few years, is to sort of write off rural Americans and really double down on a focus on urban voters. And I think there are some who have argued that there are people who actually argue pretty overtly that we shouldn't focus on rural voters, that we should double down on urban voters, and that that's where a majority of people of color live. People of color vote disproportionately, progressively, and so we should really just invest with them. But that's taking people of color for granted, first of all, and it is not. We cannot assume on the left that people of color are just naturally with us and will remain with us. We actually have to, engage with people of color and ensure that we're actively including them as part of our base. But also, there's just no way we can actually control the Senate ultimately if we aren't able to win in places like Montana. And so I think a lot of people assume that we can't win in places like Montana because they have the stereotype of they think rural means white. They think rural means conservative. Neither of those things are actually true. Rural America is, it depends on the state, but rural America is only a little less diverse than America overall, and becoming more diverse all the time. The growth in the Latino community in a lot of rural areas, even in Western Wisconsin, for example, there are small towns that the majority of the students in the school are Latino. So, we have outdated notions of who actually live in rural America. Yeah. And we also just don't understand how rural people think. Rural people are actually very economically populist. They're very mistrustful of giant corporations. They think it's incredibly unfair. We've in the Winning Jobs Narrative Project, it's a massive data set, and so we have lots of data to show this. Rural people think it's ridiculous that CEO incomes have so outpaced the incomes of average workers. They think it's ridiculous that corporations have shipped jobs overseas in pursuit of cheap labor and, robbing communities of jobs and making America vulnerable. They think it is ridiculous that pharmaceutical companies charge us 250 times what they do people in other countries for prescription drugs. And the impetus for the Winning Jobs Narrative Project really came from work with rural organizers who said, yes, the social issues have been weaponized in rural communities for sure. But the first thing that happened in rural communities is that the progressive left lost an economic narrative edge. As Democrats embraced, free trade and failed to enforce laws that allowed, monopolies to develop and agriculture to become taken over by massive industrial farms. There's not a family hog farmer left in the state of Missouri. It's really devastated this shift to trickle-down economics that really emerged with Ronald Reagan and was perpetuated to a significant degree under all presidents until this one. President Biden really is the first truly post-Reagan president in terms of re-embracing an active role for government and reining in monopolies. That means something to people in rural America because they've been run over like a truck by trickle-down economics. They're with us on that, and if we can reestablish that economic connection with rural people, it helps us have other conversations about things like LGBT equality and immigration. And I think from the perspective of someone who's spent a lot of time with rural organizers, yes, we need to be able to defend against the attacks, the cultural attacks that I think you were alluding to earlier. But we also have to have a really, really strong, progressive, populist economic vision, agenda, narrative that can rebuild strength with working class voters. And rural people, one way to think about them is they're just the most working class. 70% of rural people are non-college, as opposed to 57% of people in urban areas. Place has an amplifying effect for sure, because attitudes can intensify in closed systems, but that's part of the issue is that we have a larger challenge with working class voters, and we need to rebuild strength with working class voters that includes rural people.
And in your work, I think over your career, and especially probably right now, it's very relevant to you to be in spaces with unexpected alliances, pushing for some of these policies. I think, we hear a lot of the news, and there's this assumption that our country is very divided. And what I'm hearing in all these interviews is it's not that divided. It's these, the squeaky wheels that are kind of creating this division. So I want to hear from you about these unexpected alliances where you were able to organize and build towards the movement.
Well, for sure, that was a feature of the marriage movement. I think a key turning point late in the marriage movement is that as we were beginning to sort of lock down support of Democrats and unaffiliated people, there was a real intensified effort on the part of organizations like Freedom to Marry to build conservative support through campaigns like Young Conservatives for the Freedom to Marry, and also some very, very deep work with Republican mayors, former Republican elected officials, and by lifting up these conservative faith leaders, and by lifting up these conservative spokespeople, we were able to show people who identify more with conservatives that you can be conservative and you can still embrace, move your stance on an issue like the freedom to marry, and in fact, there are ways to think about that as a very much a conservative idea of of opportunity for and not being restricted unnecessarily by government policy from being able to live a free and full life. And I actually think on a lot of, when we allow our issues to become mired in partisanship, we're not doing ourselves on the issue or Democrats, frankly, any favors, because then it becomes a political weapon. And if an issue that I'm working on is a political weapon, then that's a real challenge, because people were so hyper-partisanized that people will default to partisan corners, and it's really, really tough to move them on an issue. We've got to be able to lift the issue out of hyper-partisanship. And then that, we went from marriage being an issue that Democrats were bludgeoned with in elections to being something that, Democrats could proudly support in elections without really feeling as though they're taking on political risk. Republicans in many districts, Republicans were also able to embrace marriage. And then we won the issue. And so I think from an issue advocacy perspective, I think we probably need to be doing a lot more bipartisan work. That can be hard to hear for a lot of advocates, but I think it's true. And then I also think that just generally we don't do a good enough job of lifting up sort of a broad range of spokespeople to be able to advocate for the things that we're working on. I think small business owners, for example, there are some organizations that focus on building networks of small business owners. Small business owners are some of the most trusted and respected people in our community, and I think that's an underutilized strategy. And even our fellow citizens who may not see eye to eye with us on everything, but they and may not identify on this where we are on the ideological spectrum, but they can be in alliance with us. Like those those opportunities exist, especially around issue advocacy on things like minimum wage increases or expanding Medicaid.
Yeah.
In recent years, we've expanded Medicaid in South Dakota and Nebraska, and we can. In some ways, this issue work around things that are so broadly popular, especially, is a great opportunity to build alliances and be able to have conversations with our fellow citizens that we can help us transcend the political divides.
Okay, as we close out, I wanted to talk about our passion, both of our shared passion for storytelling. What was the most impactful story that you came across that really lit you up to get it done? Share one story.
In my youth or just in my work?
Anything, any story that you feel like really, really fired you up.
So one tactic that we learned on marriage was the importance of what we call journey stories. Lifting up a spokesperson who, because so many of our fellow citizens feel a lot of conflict around an issue like marriage. And the same is true on immigration. Like the majority of people have conflict to some degree or another. It's not simple. Like it's on the one hand they think this, on the other hand they think that, and I think sometimes we try to make things too simple for people. Like you're either on the right side or the wrong side. What we learned on marriage was we needed to acknowledge that conflict is real, that people feel it. We called it establishing sort of emotional resonance with people, and then we need to show them a path. Like, it's okay. You can feel that and you can still move on the issue. And so we developed this tactic called journey stories, where someone would say, I haven't always been there. I was raised a certain way. I had these certain feelings, but as I've come to know more same-sex couples, I've come to realize that they're, just like us. They want to fall in love and make a lifetime commitment. And for me, I'm now over here. The most powerful example of that was President Obama, when he gave his interview with Robin Roberts, when he finally, after President Biden kind of pushed a little bit, when President Obama finally gave that interview, he gave the perfect journey story. He talked about how he was raised and how he hadn't always been there, but he'd come to know a lot of same-sex couples, and it was incredibly powerful. In polling with especially in the Black community, polling shifted dramatically almost overnight. Because someone who's highly relatable, like President Obama, sharing his own story of how he wasn't always there, but he moved, gives people permission to be able to. It's okay. You're not a bad person because you feel conflict. I felt that too, but you can feel that and still be and still move to a place where, because most people really want to do right. We all want to do right by each other, and so we've got to give people patterns to follow to be able to invoke their better angels.
Okay, last question. What is going to happen over the next year? A lot of important stuff happening. What do you expect to see by this time next year?
What I hope. So here's how I think the election is going to play out. I think this election is very much about rising costs. It's about we've invested a lot of money from a progressive perspective in trying to reshape markets, to transition to clean energy, to bring down the cost of healthcare. We have, as I said earlier, I think, President Biden really is the first truly post-Reagan president. He has utterly rejected trickle-down economics. He did it again today on his rural tour, and embraced this idea that people are the economy. What's good for people is actually good for the economy. And that government has a right and appropriate role to be very active in shaping markets, to transition to clean energy, to ensure greater equity and broader prosperity. So he's done it. We've got this body of work, and I think folks have been working really hard on the left for a long time to see a more active role for government, to winning the win on that set of laws, the Inflation Reduction Act and the American Rescue Plan, CHIPS Act, and bipartisan infrastructure law. To win the win on that means securing broad public support. What I hope we see is a massive effort to communicate at scale about the impact that those laws are making recognizing that we have a lot more work to do, that average folks out there are still struggling very much, and things are still too expensive and too hard, and wages aren't keeping up. But there is an agenda reflected in those laws that is squarely on point and exactly what people want to see, and that we as a movement can make the case for that direction as opposed to a return to tax cuts for the rich and giant corporations, and sidelining government, deregulating and allowing corporations to continue shipping jobs overseas. We have a choice to make, and I hope that the left unifies around what we have seen in Winning Jobs narrative is a very powerfully resonant vision that President Biden is articulating. The closest thing I've seen to magic words is something we've tested in Winning Jobs, which is Democrats are working to grow the economy by lowering costs and raising incomes for working people so they have the tools and opportunities to build a good life. That generates vehement affirmative head nodding from voters.
Yeah.
Their response is amen every day of the week and twice on Sunday, and please just let it be. Their only question is, are Democrats really going to do that? Because that would be motivating and mobilizing to me. And so I hope we're able to make that economic case, and I hope we're able to show voters that the rising costs that they're experiencing aren't because of those laws and the money that has been moved. They're experiencing rising costs because pharmaceutical companies are charging them 250 times what people in other countries pay. That corporate investors are buying up massive amounts of housing and driving up costs for all of us. That corporations continue to ship jobs overseas, taking away good jobs and making our supply chains vulnerable. Like that is everywhere you turn. When it comes to rising costs, there's a reason, and it's not Democratic spending.
Awesome. Well, I just want to thank you, Bobby. You've been a cheerleader for me from the front, from behind, from the sidelines. You're always there supporting me. So I wouldn't be where I am today with all my successes without your support. So thank you so much. And thank you for joining me and talking to me. Hopefully I'll have you back in a couple months and we'll start evaluating what's happening, because I think that we're going to hear really what direction or what visions these elected leaders have for the country. So I hope to discuss that soon in a couple months.
I'd love to. It's great to be with you always.
Thank you, Bobby. Thank you for watching Alvina Talks Shift. Please like, share, and subscribe. And as always, engage, empower, evolve. If you liked this episode, or if you want more content like this, go to alvinatalkshift.com or wherever you listen to podcasts.